standoff with the PLA, its fallout. He has held the office of the defense attaché at the embassies of India, Japan, and the Republic of Korea.
Brigadier Praveen Badrinath, serving Chief Engineer of a Corps, is a graduate in Defense and Strategic Studies. In almost 3 decades of service in the Indian Army, he has been deployed in active operational areas and has commanded 2 combat engineer units. He has been a UN peacekeeper in Congo, handling civil military coordination and humanitarian intervention operations. He has been awarded the Chairman, Chief of Staff, and Chief of Army Staff Commendation cards and has been the winner of the prestigious USI Gold Medal and Reward Prize essay competitions.
Ambassador Ambassador Gurjeet Singh is a former Indian diplomat with 37 years of experience. He has been the ambassador of India to Germany, Indonesia, Ethiopia, ASEAN, and the African Union. He was the Sherpa for the first 2 Indian-African summits, and his book, The Injera and the Paratha on India and Ethiopia, was well received. He has also written books on India's relationship with Japan, Indonesia, and Germany. He is an honorary professor of humanities at the Indian Institute of Technology, Indore, and he chairs the CII Business Task Force on the Trilateral Cooperation in Africa.
Moderating this session is Major General A.P. Singh, Divisional Commander of an Army division in Northern Command responsible for operations in Ladakh and Kashmir. He has studied intelligence analysis and global security at the University of Maryland, USA. He's interacted with the US intelligence fraternity on issues such as structures and methodologies in counter-terrorist operations. He has presented papers on counterinsurgencies at the Brookings Institution and on internal security architecture of India at the Heritage Foundation at Washington, D.C. Co-author of a book, Maoist Insurgency and India's Internal Security Architecture, we present to you the panel.
Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the panel on the strategic shift in the pivot of geography. I am Major General Amritpal Singh, and on behalf of the Military Literature Festival Association, I welcome you all to this panel discussion. The panelists have just been introduced to you, and I shall now move ahead to just giving a small, quick introduction on the basic of the topic, which is mostly geopolitical in nature. To all students of geopolitics and geostrategy, 3 or 4 names immediately come to mind for their famous theories. We've had Alfred Mahan, who in 1890 brought about the theory of sea power. And then we've had Halford Mackinder, who in 1904 wrote the almost iconic paper, The Geographic Pivot of History. Then comes Nicholas Spikeman, who spoke about the Rimland theory, and this was in 1942. And we've, of course, had George Kennan, who's talked about the containment policies and had dictated the containment policies, mostly followed by the USA, which came up in 1947. That being as it is, it's the geographical pivot of history which speaks of a heartland, which Halford Mackinder spoke of. And this heartland, he actually split the world into 3 major sections. One he called the World Island, which was actually the landmass that spread and interlinked the continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa to certain parts of Africa. The second he called offshore islands. The offshore islands were the islands which were around Japan and the Isles of England. And of course, what he often called the outlying islands were, in fact, large countries, North America, South America, and the Oceania group of Australia and the islands around it. Now, in these 3, the interplay which he always posited was that the heartland is at the key and the center of the world island. And this stretched from the Volga to the Yangtze and from the Himalayas to the Arctic. He also called this the pivot area, and hence the word pivot of geography, since this pivot in his theory was the key to world domination. And in an era when there was a declining and the invincibility of sea power was seen going down, this theory caught on very well. Somewhere in 1919, Mackinder summarized his theory in a very almost unforgettable statement, which I quote: "Who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island, and who rules the world island commands the world. The world island at that time almost controlled 50% of the world's resources. As opposed to him came Nicholas Spikeman later, who spoke of the rimland theory. This theory spoke of the strip of coastland which was between the great oceans and the heartland, and he posited that the Central Asian zone was not as important as the rim of seafaring and amphibian countries which bordered with the heartland. He felt that the countries which looked after the coastal areas were actually in a better position to choke the heartland, to contain the heartland, and therefore they were more important and not the heartland. So these two theories were heartland versus rimland, and it's but natural to think of the heartland giving land-based mobility and gaining importance due to land-based mobility, and therefore the major empires came up there, like the Mongol Empire and the Russian Empire. It also was a major area where routes could go through. There was trade which happened, exchange of spirituality, a lot of ideas were changed around, and the famous Silk Route went through this heartland. The rimland, however, is based more on amphibian power, sea power, and coastal areas came up with another theory called the buffer zones. The buffer zones were countries like Afghanistan and Myanmar, to which the heartland countries found access towards the seas. So the focus in these years shifted, and the eminence shifted from heartland as being the basis of national power to the maritime space, which suddenly started taking over. So while these theories were being posited, America came up with a theory, or with its own postulations and its own policy, which was dictated by the heartland theory, which then led to the containment theory, which George Kennan had posited, and America built its foreign policy based on the heartland. And America, Germany, Japan, and many other countries were very influenced by the heartland theory and the various other theories that revolved around it. On this panel today, I'd like to first ask Ambassador Gurjeet Singh, who's traveled the world, who's seen diplomatic missions in most countries, to give us his opening comments on what he thinks of the heartland and the shifting pivot of geography in today's context, where we see China emerging as a major player, as a player who is perceived as planning to transfer this heartland and rimland theory, or bring in its own self and bring its own prominence into this pivot. Over to you, Ambassador. We are having a sound issue with Ambassador Gurjeet. So while they resolve that, I'll ask my other co-panelist, Brigadier Badrinath, to make his opening comments. And I'd ask him to give us his own understanding of the heartland theory and what he feels about the Chinese influence and the Chinese perspective on it. Over to you.
Thank you, sir. A very good afternoon to all of you. It's an honor to be here. And in the next few minutes, I will attempt to present my perception of the Chinese perspective of the heartland theory. We just heard what Alfred Mahan and Mackinder had to say, and we're all generally aware of what they said. But what we can't say with surety is whether the Chinese are following the same theory. In a lighter vein, we don't even know if there is a Mandarin translation of these texts. But what we can say with conclusive evidence is what I would like to bring out in my argument. Firstly, one observes the pattern of events over the last few decades, since the World War II, all the way up to the breakup of the Soviet Union. It almost took about 45 years. We can decipher a pattern that indicates that China is slowly but surely moving towards that theory. I will substantiate it briefly with my points. Firstly, China is sitting in the fabled natural fortress which Mackinder had made a mention of. It has a very potent armed force and has excellent access to warm water ports, something that the Soviet Union and Russia always had a problem with. China retains the ability to expand in different directions at least on land, without countering any major sea power, which was again one of the tenets of Macintosh's theory. At the same time, China has made an effort to resolve most of its outstanding border issues with most of the 14 countries that they share borders with. Sino-Russian cooperation is a different cup of tea. Starting from a little difficult partnership, they have moved leaps and bounds in the realms of military and energy security. And today, China has made Russia look like a willing partner, what with its woes of economic problems, that Russia is ready to toe the line of China, given China's economic clout. Coming to the Central Asian republics, what Russia was intending to do, China has managed to do. They have surpassed Russia as being the largest trading partner of the Central Asian republics and have created a great deal of overland infrastructure. The maritime Silk Route that China is planning perfectly complements the overland routes that they are planning as part of the BRI, thus giving it access to the fabled world islands, which General A.P. Singh just spoke about. In addition to that, a large amount of infrastructure projects are being rolled out in terms of roads, ports, railways, and even bridges as far as Eastern Europe. As of today, the Central Asian countries provide about 40% of the gas imports, thereby reducing Russia's stranglehold in the energy sector. The overland pipeline all the way from Turkmenistan to China is testimony to that, giving China a very, very important fillip in the much needed energy security domain. China's leadership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the involvement in the Central and the East European countries is again indicative of its seriousness in the region. Though there are a few hiccups within Eastern European countries of late, it seems that the economic might of the Chinese may eventually prevail. The Yiwu-Madrid railway line, extending over 12,000 kilometers, has heartland written all over it. China has also been a major contributor in Africa's infrastructure. So much so that they say these days that any big project in an African city greater than 3 floors or any road more than 3 kilometers long is likely to have a Chinese engineer or an execution agency. In the end, it would be safe to conclude that a general perception that China is playing out the heartland theory to a very well synchronized end state is not wrong. Adding to that is the emphasis on the civilization state as opposed to just a nation state to enhance its global structure.
I will now go back to Ambassador Gurjeet, and if you've sorted out his audio problem, may I request you to make your opening comments, please?
Can you hear me now?
Very clearly.
Okay, thank you. So I'm very happy to be with such eminent people on this panel, and I heard Brigadier Badrinath quite clearly. So, you mentioned the Mahan theory, but I think sometimes we overlook the Olaf Caro great game. So while Mahan was a theory, Caro used to play the great game in which these theories played a role. Now, this great game, which essentially was the British Empire trying to keep Tsarist Russia out of the warm waters of the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, continues to be played. But today, the players are very different. Today, for instance, all the Central Asian republics are not part of the Soviet Union. We have Pakistan. We have China, which has now come in, which earlier was buffered by Tibet during British times. Iran plays a much bigger role. But frankly speaking, thanks to connectivity and technology, the world has flattened. And today, all territories and all seas are open for contention. Simply something, the Indian Ocean is at the Pacific Ocean today are called the Indo-Pacific. This just shows the flattening of the whole world. Brigadier Badrinath has very capably brought out several aspects. For instance, if you take the Chinese outreach to Central Asia and to Europe. In Europe, it's very interesting. It is what is called Central Europe, the 17 plus 1. There's a large amount of Europe is now toadying up to China purely for economic reasons. And the same as he had mentioned for Africa. Now, if you look at all these areas, what you find that the Chinese are doing is actually building connectivity. They are building, the trans-European, trans-Central Asian railways. They are building a large amount of railways in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and they are building ports. So if you see the BRI, for instance, it has 118 projects under it. Interestingly, out of the 118, 46 are listed in Pakistan. 46 in Pakistan alone. 22 BRI projects in ASEAN, out of which 7 are in Indonesia. And in Central Asia, there are 9, but most of them are very large. Europe itself has about 7 BRI projects. Russia has 1. Africa has 14. But, when you classify something as BRI, it is not very clear because many projects under BRI actually precede the BRI and have been loaded onto BRI purely for funding reasons. Now, having said that, what do you have today? You have China making inroads everywhere purely due to deep pockets. But China is failing to develop its own domestic market. For instance, China's main trade in Africa was with 5 countries, mainly to procure raw materials from them. Given the downturn in China, which preceded the COVID, China stopped importing these raw materials from most of them, leading to severe shocks in those countries. So China's economic engagement is fraught with danger. Its projects do not have a business plan because their companies are not used to business. They are just used to doing things. When I was in Kenya last year, they have a Mombasa Railway, Mombasa-Nairobi Railway. You know what they call it? They call it a plan to build the Chinese economy because no local company ever gets a hand into the Chinese contracts. Now, this is how China is developing, and I think Brigadier Badrinath mentioned the Jiwu-Madrid Railway. Now, that railway is partly run by Deutsche Bahn, the German railways. Now, German Railways runs it purely on contract to make money. The railway does not make any money because it brings in Chinese exports, but it has nothing to take back except occasional olive oil or wine. So Chinese projects are not economic projects. They are strategic projects. They do not abide by timelines, but they play the great game very effectively. And I think that is the danger that we need to look at in our future comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was a very good introduction and a holistic view, including a little mention of the BRI, which we'll go to in detail later. And your mention of how Badri and you have said that China is becoming central and trying to become that proverbial heartland is our basic topic of discussion today. Of course, it has dimensions like what you brought out, the BRI, and what development and what certain projects that have been loaded onto these, which we'll go to in our phase 2, where we would ask all our panelists to speak with more detail on the border and roads initiative. But I now have my final panelist, Lieutenant General Bali, to speak on his understanding of the geography of and how China and its relevance come to this whole play of heartland and its pivotal geography. Over to you, Bali.
Fellow panelists, ladies, gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you. Well, I shall be giving you a different perception of the geographical pivot and its strategic shift, if any. Why we discuss this pivot, as has been mentioned by the previous speakers, is primarily due to the phenomenal rise of China in the last 3 decades. and the heartland, which was alluded to, Central Asian region, and then Eastern Europe. It has an uncanny resemblance to the heartland mentioned in the treatise by Mackinder almost a century back. But how relevant is that today? Well, Mackinder's theory, his essay, has been questioned for its relevance. But to be fair to him, he did not have the advantage of hindsight. There was no air power at that time. And the complete story was more Eurasia centric, or maybe later with other people, it was more US centric. Today, with that hindsight advantage, we need to examine this geographical pivot and how it's coming about in today's world. With time, geographical pivots come up in different parts of the globe. And what do they depend upon? On the economic and military might of the nations that are on the ascendant at a given point in history. To put it in context, I'll just do a scan of the last 70 years. Post Second World War, to my understanding, the geographical pivot was transatlantic, with United States, mainland United States on the west, and continental Europe on the east. And this came about as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, there was a dramatic shift in the geographical pivot from transatlantic to Asia Pacific, where it has been for over the last 2 decades now. Are we about to see another strategic shift as is being suggested? Well, to understand that fully, I think we need to examine the main player on the table right now, that is China. Its Belt and Road Initiative appears to be the architecture on which this complete pivot is going to be based. And it is spreading from the east coast of China westwards across the Central Asian region. What is its efficacy? How do the different players impact upon it? Then China itself. China is a big power. It is holding everyone's attention, but at the same time, it's an enigma. It has always remained an enigma, not transparent at all. So there is a definite need of a reality check on China and also to understand the various problems with which it is plagued. And is it up to it to play that dominant role in controlling the strategic pivot of history? And finally, there are other major players across the globe which can't be ignored, which will continue to influence geopolitics in a big way. So as we go along in today's discussion, I shall be dilating upon these aspects, and then we can take a call whether there really is a strategic shift in the direction as is being suggested.
Thank you, Bali, for that opening comments of yours. But it brought out a very interesting point. And that interesting point is that most of Western and US strategic thinking has been dictated by the theories of and these were established somewhere in the late 1940s, and they've been dictated by the heartland and the rimland theories. And that is why the notion that Russia was the biggest potential enemy, as you brought out, to the United States, emanated from the fact that Russia was sitting on that Mackinder's heartland, and therefore nuclear deterrence and all other forms of deterrence that the United States started building up was because they were so influenced by this heartland theory. And that probably is one of the reasons why that pivot, which came up transatlantic, like you said, was pitted against the pivot that came up in Mackinder's heartland, so to speak. But Spikeman's rimland theory also played a small part, and that determined American policy of containment. Because then they realized that if you hold the rimland and are able to contain the heartland, probably their economic interest, their strategic interests will be met. So that was a very interesting opening session that we've had from all our speakers. But I'd like now to go to the more important and infrastructural project which China has talked about, and through which emanates China's power, both in terms of economic power, its ability to supply money to, and like somebody spoke, deep pockets, which it had, and its whole initiative, which is now called the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative, as generally known, is a US $1 trillion project which encompasses about 70 countries, caters for about 65% of the world's population, and about handles and I mean aims to handle about 40% of the GDP of the world. With that being, what is important to note is 60% of the lending is coming from China. So the deep pockets which you spoke about, and the and Chinese projects which had started building up earlier, which Ambassador Gurjeet spoke about, and now being loaded on to the BRI, seem to be a kind of a grand plan. And we're talking about this grand plan as of now as to how the BRI, how the Maritime Silk Route initiative, which is also co-spoken of with the BRI, will influence China's predominance. And like Bali will bring out later, is there actually aim at bringing out preeminence and dominance here? I'll first go to my friend Badrinath, Brigadier Badrinath, and ask him to speak about his manifestation of the heartland theory and the theory in overland routes, and what does he think of the BRI?
Thank you, sir, once again. I'll start off where I left last. It is evident that China is busy engaging Central and East European nations the most, apart from Asia, with their BRI. Like the ambassador said, the 17+1. Granting that the world islands, as per Mackinder's theory, are Europe, Asia, and Africa, the BRI, along with the Maritime Silk Route, is trying or attempting to integrate the entire area into China's zone of influence. The 6 overland corridors are: first one straddling the Indo-China Peninsula, second one being the Bangladesh, India, Myanmar corridor, thirdly being the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the Central and the West Asia corridor, the new Eurasia land bridge, and lastly, but not the least, the Mongolian and Russian Economic Corridor. Apart from these major projects or major corridors that China is planning, they have also released a white paper on their Arctic theory or the Arctic policy, indicating its clear commitment and responsibility to the future of the world. Remember that Mackinder spoke of the boundaries of the heartland being from the Himalayas to the Arctic. Coming back to the BRI corridors, what are the major advantages China is looking at? Firstly, it's obviously is going to establish and give a firm access to China to all these affected areas. Of course, there are many murmurs of debt trap financing and smaller countries falling a prey to China's debt trap. However, that be as it is, the work is going on full swing. The impetus of trade is definitely going to have a positive effect on China's economy, which had a few roadblocks, as the ambassador had brought out. However, I think China's visualization of this is that it is going to offer the yuan as an alternative to the US dollar in the years to come if everything goes as per plan. The sheer size and magnitude of the project is bound to project China as a global power for having brought it together in the first place. It will also give unhindered access and avenues for Chinese soft power to be projected, as well as hard power if necessary, and eventually elevate its global status. Closer home, China's initiative in the Indo-China Peninsula, as well as the CPEC, have strategic implications vis-a-vis India. China also gains access to much more resources, men and material resources, and probably can find, other than emerging markets, also lower manufacturing hubs outside China itself. At the same time, everything is not just advantages about the BRI. There are many risks. There are some unwritten risks. Let me dwell on a few of them. Like I mentioned earlier, the debt trap theory is slowly making nations, even as small as Montenegro, wary of the BRI effort. After the initial euphoria of the Chinese highway project, which was funded by them, the nation is now seeing red as its debt increases. Nations are also wary of possible exploitation of these key infrastructure assets, such as arterial highways, airports, and ports by any of the powers later. The cost and time overruns of such massive projects can never be underemphasized. As in the case of the CPEC or the 1 billion railway line between Budapest and Belgrade, the cost and time overruns have been substantial, and we are all aware of the kind of problems that these countries are facing now. More often than not, this is likely to have a damaging effect on the host country rather than on China. While we all are generally aware of the Indian response to the CPEC, the European nations are having a mixed response to this initiative of late. There seems to be an individual reaction towards China based on each one's bilateral relationship with China. While Italy, Hungary, and Greece have signed bilateral MOUs with China, UK, France, and Germany are watching the developments closely. Another major issue may be the vast differences in the culture, labor, and environmental standards being followed by these countries vis-a-vis the policies and practices used by the Chinese companies and the Chinese government. The EU has already voiced its concern on some of these issues. Overall, it appears that some countries are wary that the BRI may become a one-way street for Chinese goods and services, while some others who desperately need the infrastructure may eventually welcome it. While this is true for Europe, the same cannot be said of Africa. Africa is already the largest bilateral creditor of China, with a combination of grants, aids, and low-cost loans for development financing. While the US and the Europe grappled with financial trouble, China is relentless in its investment in Africa, having invested in more than 50 out of the 54 countries and also having signed MOUs with the African Union. China has been systematic about its investments in Africa. Firstly, developing ports. Secondly, the road and rail lines to connect the hinterland to the ports. Thirdly, connecting the mineral resource to these lines. Thereafter, consequently, creating dependence on infrastructure investment, leading to deficit financing for some of these countries at times. And lastly, a notable point is most of these projects are largely bilateral, which means there is no third nation or no third development agency. It is only between China and that particular host country. Overall, it suffices to say that the BRI is very ambitious and has very, very high payoffs for China if they manage to pull it off by sorting out the perception battle and managing to complete projects on time. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigadier Badrinath. I'd like to bring out an interesting fact as to why it's called the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, the original name of the project was, as I'd like to read out, Silk Road Economic Belt and 21st Century Maritime Silk Road Development Strategy. It was quite a long one in Chinese. And this was converted later on to One Road, One Belt, One Road policy. But now, when we talk of it as Belt and Road Initiative, there are two parts to it. One is the belt part, which is actually actually refers to the Silk Road Economic Belt, which is the erstwhile Silk Route, overland route, which passed through Central Asia, landlocked countries like Central Asia and West Asia, Europe, and then on to Western Europe. And when they talk of the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, the road part refers to this 21st Century Maritime Silk Road Initiative. So there are two distinct parts. One, overland, following the erstwhile Silk Route, famous Silk Road, and now the maritime route, which the ambassador and Brigadier Badrinath alluded to when they talk of development of ports and using the sea as a medium of transportation. I'd now like to request General Bali to speak of his the Central Asia and the efficacy of China's BRI in his perspective.
Well, thank you. As we examine this, let's move from the east to the west, where the main architecture of this Belt and Road Initiative is emanating and going in that direction. It starts, of course, from the prosperous areas of eastern and southeastern China. Now, that is the real heartland of China, and that's where it's populated by the ethnic homogeneity, mainly the Hans. And then it moves westwards into Xinjiang, the earlier name of Tibet, and Xinjiang, dominated by the Uyghurs. And that's where we find changes taking place. It's already a heterogeneous ethnicity, and they are different and they are disgruntled, to put it mildly. China has tried to sort out Tibet by balkanizing it, and unfortunately, the rest of the world has fallen prey to it by referring to the Tibet Autonomous Region, which is just 1/3 of the original Tibet. And of course, we are well aware of the political and other problems which are existing in that area. And then we come to Xinjiang, which is much more volatile, where there have been open demonstrations and a bid for secessionism. And China has not hesitated to use the heavy hand, as PLA and the jackboot, to suppress them. But the problems continue in a big way. And this BRI, the roads of prosperity, so-called roads of prosperity, goes to such an area. We come to the Central Asian republics. We spoke about the linkages with China. Well, closer to Xinjiang, I think ethnically they're closer to the Uyghurs. And then one should not forget that these Central Asian republics were part of the erstwhile USSR. And the linkages, bonds, and I would even say dependencies with Russia are very strong. And not to forget, India has a distinct footprint in this region, which is, I think, would be known to the audience and which is of great significance. And as we go further west, we spoke about Iran. There has been mention of China, Pakistan, Iran axis. Well, I wouldn't agree with that at all. Iran is a very old civilization with a distinct identity. And talking of Iran and Pakistan in the same breath, there are major differences. They may have temporarily papered over some of the problems, but the schisms are very clear and distinct. What has pushed Iran more towards China, I would say largely is American policy, and that too during the Republican dispensations. So Iran also sought convergence of interests with China. But with change of governments, policies change, and Iran cannot be permanently viewed in the China camp. Now, with that kind of a situation, this old Silk Route, which has got a new name, which the moderator mentioned, how China is identifying its BRI going to that region. The old Silk Route was primarily for trade. It had no real geopolitical dimensions to it. Why China has gone in over there? Is it with a grand design? Well, one of the reasons, China feels hemmed in by the United States' influence in the island chains, the first island chain and the second island chain, which is towards the Pacific and towards the south and east of China. And therefore, the desire for developing this new Silk Road. But will all this lead to a pivot in this area? Well, talking of the BRI, earlier known as the OBOR, what is it? If you see the original document, maybe it's because of the translation from Mandarin, it's clumsily worded, and I would even say ham-handedly executed. China has gone at great lengths to convince the participating nations, which are mostly underdeveloped economies from the third world, that it is for their benefit, for their good, for their prosperity. But make no mistake, the BRI is no Marshall Plan. It's plain and simple, a thinly disguised debt trap. And I think that is being increasingly realized by all countries, even Myanmar, and even where the maritime facilities are coming up in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. Both these countries have realized the economic pitfalls involved in this kind of dealings with China. And the BRI itself, in every place in the region or in the globe, has not been free from controversy. There has not been any smooth sailing. To talk of the BRI closest to us, the CPEC or the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. First and foremost, it goes through land, Indian land, illegally occupied by China and Pakistan. And then it runs from north to south to the port city on the coast of Pakistan in Gwadar. It has been beset with problems. And in fact, only a couple of days back, the Pakistan army had to step in and take on a bigger role in pushing it towards completion. So that's the state of affairs of the BRI, which is being developed in a country which is an all-weather ally. Therefore, it's not all smooth sailing as far as this particular infrastructure project is concerned. So, with that as a backdrop, will that lead to a pivot over there in Central Asia? That remains a big question mark. And I think we need to look more closely and try to see through the opaqueness of China to understand it.
Thank you, General Wali. That was a very interesting point that you brought out regarding the famous debt trap that many economists and many observers have been mentioning about China's investment in the BRI. While it's fair to agree that most of the countries have long-term capital gains as they would look at to get from the BRI, it is also important to note that many of these projects, especially along the port cities, along where the maritime routes plan to move, were already invested in and were being developed as ports to handle larger traffic. So I'd like to ask Ambassador Gurjeet, who has been around in and around the Horn of Africa quite a while, as to what he thinks of the ports that are coming up right from the South China Sea to Kyokpo in Rangoon, to Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and also to the ports on the eastern coast of Africa. What is your perception, and what can India do about countering the BRI once you speak of the Horn of Africa? Over to you.
Thank you. So the BRI is a manifestation of the realist policy that China follows, unlike the liberal policy most of us follow, simply because they have much greater robustness of ability to provide much more than us. Secondly, we have heard a lot of talk today about Europe and Russia and China. You see, the European view of China is different from India's view of China, because to them, the enemy is Russia on their doorstep. And they object to things like Ukraine and Crimea, leading to sanctions on Russia, which pushed Russia into Chinese arms. This European action was detrimental to Indian interests because it created a very strong Russian-Chinese nexus, which earlier we could leverage, but now we can't. The European Union declares China a systemic rival. But if you see all their actions, they are anti-Russia, and economically they are quite happy to engage with China. You look at the Indo-Pacific doctrine, which Germany has announced and Netherlands has announced, and very soon EU will announce. They don't even mention China. It is like a trade opening measure to the Indo-Pacific, because the pivot today is the Indo-Pacific. I personally do not see Central Asia as the pivot because it is uncontested. The Russians are not contesting China. China has a free run in Central Asia. Therefore, I do not consider it a challenge or something. It's happened. But Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, and the larger conglomeration of the Indo-Pacific, which runs from the Horn of Africa to Hawaii or beyond, is an area of major concern, because as Brigadier Badrinath pointed out, a lot of trade goes here. General Bali pointed out the strategic relevance, the resources, the blue economy. Well, everything which needs to happen is happening here. If it happened peacefully, then I would not even call it a pivot, because you simply collaborate. But the structure of the East Asia Summit, which was meant to maintain peace and harmony in this region, with ASEAN centrality at the core, has fallen apart due to Chinese hegemony over the region, which is more or less established. The 9-dash line is no more imaginary permanent court of arbitration decision or not. It is a reality. Today, the ASEAN countries have to accept the 9-dash line, and Chinese influence over it if they like it or not. Most of them have decided to go with the BRI benefits rather than contest the 9-dash line because they do not have the capacity to do so. So, who is going to make this region the pivot? The Americans had withdrawn. Otherwise, before the Chinese came in, the Americans were underwriting the security of Southeast Asia, of ASEAN countries. But that is gone. So today you have 4 members of the East Asian Summit who now constitute the Quad. Gentlemen, I put it to you, the Quad is the first challenge to the concept of ASEAN centrality, which means that the old idea that everything will govern and run around ASEAN, which was browbeaten by China, is today being contested by the Quad, which says, forget ASEAN centrality. We will deal with this on its own terms. Secondly, what does it say? Forget BRI. We don't think BRI is succeeding. Let us go for a decoupling from China by opening new resilient value chains between, let us say, Japan, Australia, India, and ASEAN, or including France and bringing in Germany and other EU countries. So there is a very real challenge to the BRI concept and realist posture, which includes strategic aggression by China. But the BRI is not a success. There is not a single project under BRI which has been completed to date. But countries have to start paying back. In the case of Kenya, the Mombasa Railway is ready, but it doesn't earn revenue. So the revenue is being taken out of the guarantees of the profits of the Mombasa port. Same has happened to Djibouti on the Addis Djibouti Railway. Nobody travels on the railway, but somebody has to pay the bill. So like what happened in Hambantota, you will have this problem in many places. The last point I want to make is this. What can India do? India has been furthering its interests by promoting the Kaladan multimodal project in Myanmar. It has looked at the trilateral highway from northeast India through Myanmar into Thailand, later perhaps going into Vietnam and Cambodia. We are looking at a new port in Sabang in Indonesia, in Aceh. We are looking at the Roang port, which Vizag has signed some agreements in Thailand. But our efforts on our own lack the implementation capacity and the funding capacity which China has. So therefore, the only way we can move forward is through more trilateral concepts with, let us say, like Australia or Japan, and do projects in these countries which will have better planning and implementation as well as profits for those countries. Last point, absolutely. In our neighborhood, we are comfortable with countries who reach out to China for economic engagement, including BRI. The Bangladesh model, so long as they keep the lines open for Indian projects and do not mess up our security through their alignment with China. This is the error the earlier governments in Sri Lanka and Maldives made, and now perhaps Nepal was trying to make. But the Bangladesh model, where you buy lots of stuff from China, the Chinese are all over the place, but you do not allow them to threaten India's security and keep the doors open for India. This is the kind of model that we can pursue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That was a perspective which complemented what General Bali said in a way, that the BRI is not such a big success. And the second part is whether China is the pivot, and are we actually looking at China the pivot? But 2 points I'd like to bring out is that the geography itself has bestowed a great advantage on China. Of course, it brings along its own disadvantages. But Xinjiang and Tibet are 2 areas which are very much aligned towards the heartland, and its coastal regions are part of the rimland. So they have a combination of both the heartland and the rimland in the old theory speak, so to say. And when we talk of what the ambassador alluded to as to the Indo-Pacific alliance and the Indo-Pacific region as the emerging pivot, then yes, our discussion does encompass an emerging pivot. Is the pivot of geography always going to remain at the heartland, or are we talking of another pivot that comes up here in the area of the Indo-Pacific, or is it in the Indian Ocean region? And how will it manifest itself depending on these fringe states, or depending on the coastal areas, depending on areas which we plan to develop? So, but one irrevocable fact is, and what the ambassador did bring out, was that China and Russia are not competing. There is no, it's almost like a free run to China, because they are aligned, very well aligned, because they have heartland interests. And they are that central, both of them belong to that central heartland. And therefore, they are working towards their own overland routes and their own benefits. But what this discussion does bring out is, we need to take a reality check on whether China is actually emerging as the pivot. Is China able to exploit its straddling of both the heartland and the rimland? And for this, I'd like to invite General Bali to bring about a reality check on whether China is what we all see it to be.
Well, thank you. Before I do a quick reality check on China, as I perceive it, I would strongly like to endorse what Ambassador Gurjeet mentioned about Europe's perception of Russia vis-a-vis China, very different from ours. I had an opportunity to attend a seminar at the Royal USI in London, where all the heads of chiefs of NATO armies were there. And one almost felt as we were back in the Cold War era, and they expected the Russian tanks to come rolling down the Black Forest anytime. Well, that apart, a reality check on China. I am of the strong view that China is definitely overestimated, and mainly because of its economic growth. Now, this economic growth and the manufacturing hubs in mainland China, they really hide the problems that lie deep inside it. The term that I would like to use to describe China is, in fact, oxymoronic. It's not a communist regime. It's a totalitarian state, an authoritarian state with a free market economy. Well, what can be more diverse? The political structure is extremely rigid, and it's dependent completely on its military. It draws its strength from the People's Liberation Army. Probably this is the only country of significance where the armed forces, it's not a country's armed forces, it's the party's armed forces. The allegiance of the PLA is to the Communist Party, a very strange system of governance. And any opposition to the government policy is considered an act of war. We saw the actions in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and now, of course, what's happening and has been happening for a few years in Hong Kong is abundantly clear. The Communist Party of China expends phenomenal energy and effort in trying to show that everything is hunky-dory. Now, this is not really the signs of a power that can influence a big pivot of geography and continue to sustain its eminent position on the world table. That's my take on the reality check on China, very briefly. Subsequently, I shall dilate upon the problems that are existing inside China.
Thank you very much, General Bali. I'd like to just again go back to Spikeman, who almost very prophetically said these words, and I quote, "A modern and vitalized and militarized China is going to be a threat not only to Japan, which was its enemy at that time, but also to the position of the Western powers in the Asiatic Mediterranean." Now, as this goes about, I'd like to invite Ambassador Gurjeet to speak a little about why, and his reference to the 9-dash line and the South China Sea was in passing when he spoke of the BRI and the other initiative. But why is it that why is the South China Sea considered as the girdle of sea power by China, and what is the manifestation of China and the 9-dash line and its forays into and ignoring the international courts rulings on the South China Sea? What is that brings about it, and what is driving China to do this, other than, of course, the economic issues that we're all aware of? Is there an aim at challenging the US? Is there a trans-Pacific initiative? Is there a trans-Pacific aim? Do let us know, and over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you. I can only share a perspective because in international politics, nothing is definitive accept prudence. Prudence is the only definitive part of international politics, as Morgenthau used to. One country which is totally impudent is China. So they don't follow Morgenthau either. They follow their own logic. You know, if you look at World War II, which General Bali alluded to, the Japanese were trying to create what was called the Greater Co-Prosperity Sphere, which started in Japan and went up to Burma, right? So if you simply say the Chinese are replicating that, you know, finding colonies for the market and to source what they want, then the Greater Co-Prosperity Sphere is like a kind of a model. The 9-dash line simply is the limits of their fishing rights. So it is not often understood. People think that the Chinese are coming to the South China Sea for the oil and gas. Yes, all that is there. But do you realize that it is to feed the large populations that they need the fish of all the oceans that they can reach? That is why China has among the most potent fishing fleets of anybody in the world. And this has gone under the radar of everybody. Now, when they go as far as the Natuna Sea, which was barely at the edge of the 9-dash line in Indonesia, they're always followed by Coast Guard patrols. So they are using their military muscle to acquire fish from all over the place and say, we are going to eat this. They really need that for the protein needs of their country. Of course, there's oil, gas, there are other things, but basically it is that. And secondly, it is an exercise of power. Now, I said that in Central Asia, the Chinese had no contention with the Soviet Union or Russia. Well, in the South China Sea, since 2012, the Obama pivot to Asia never happened. So the Chinese actually marched into Southeast Asia quite unopposed. The ASEAN is not an organization which is built to deal with such a challenge. They had always outsourced their security, and their outsourced agency, the United States, was now not able to perform. So they don't know who to turn to, but if you say that we deal with the Quad, they feel very unhappy because the Chinese are seen as opposing America. But supposing there is an Indonesia, Australia, India trilateral, or an India, Vietnam, Japan trilateral, I believe these individual ASEAN countries will be much more comfortable with this, and they will be able to palm this off the Chinese, saying there are no Americans involved. The Americans are not a trading force in any case. They are not in RCEP. They are even withdrew from the TPP. So today it is China and Japan who are the leading economic forces of this region. Thirdly, when we talk of BRI, it is a very sexy thing to say. But as I said, no BRI project has succeeded. And please remember, the total outlay of BRI so far in Southeast Asia is only 30% of Japanese investment in infrastructure in Southeast Asia, even today. So they are by no means the leading player. So if India, Japan, Australia, and others get together, and we can get some ASEAN countries to stand up for themselves, not all will not stand, some stand up for themselves, we can perhaps have a challenge to China, which in the post-pandemic period could become through, if not decoupling, at least creating alternate resilient supply chains. And that is the way that you challenge China economically. I don't think there's any need to challenge them militarily, because nobody is going to support you in that. And I think what the Southeast Asians look for are benign military forces who can support them in what is called humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, particularly around the Ring of Fire. So this is the most potent threat, not the Chinese. It is the Ring of Fire and the natural disaster which affects most of the maritime countries of Southeast Asia, and in which Indian Navy has played a signature role in providing HADR. And I think that remains a core strength which we must cultivate. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was a look into the next phase which we were uh, morphing into, about how and what can we do to uh, build our own national interests, to ensure that India's national interests stay going. But before that, it would be of relevance to understand what are China's problems. We've always talked about China's initiatives, and there was a speak by in Bali, reality check of China and their problems. But a little more specifics of China's problems would help us understand as to how to articulate and how to go about building our own national interest, irrespective of the fact that China is doing what it has to do. Over to you, General Bali.
Thank you. Well, China comes across, of course, as a very powerful country which has grown phenomenally, as I mentioned, in the last 3 decades. Economically, a great military might. But I also said that it's a very opaque country, very difficult to unravel, enigmatic. But if you look deep inside, there are issues. And if you were, let's say, a fly on the wall in the Communist Party headquarters, privy to the inner confabulations of the Politburo, or for that matter, even in the Central Military Commission, the CMC, what would you learn or hear? What is China worried about? First and foremost is the peripheral areas inside the Chinese country. I alluded to them right in the beginning when I spoke about Tibet and Xinjiang and the major issues that are existing over there. You can add to that the Ni Mongol area in the north. Then we have problems in Hong Kong. The whole world is aware of that. There are major problems not going away. And the biggest festering sore is Taiwan, just below the Chinese underbelly. And every time there's a problem. In fact, today itself, the so-called 70th year of relationship between India and China, which was to be celebrated in a certain way, is not being done. And in fact, the cultural troopers from Taiwan are getting pride of place. So China is always worried because it sort of challenges its one nation theory. And we know the American policies related to Taiwan. Then the issues in the South China Sea, the 9-dash line, and what all China has been doing over there. In fact, it has violated international judicial rulings about the rights of other nations in the South China Sea. Senkaku Islands are well known, the great dispute and the conflict with Japan, an ongoing process. Then, of course, the South Tibet. Now, South Tibet is actually the LSE, which is between India and China. We have disputed and sensitive areas in Arunachal, in southwest Bhutan, neighboring Sikkim, and now in East Ladakh in a big way. In 2017, China was going roughshod all over the South China Sea in a manner bullying and pulverizing the smaller ASEAN nations. And then it came rolling down into the Doklam Plateau, trying to get closer to the Jampheri Ridge, which would bring them within visual distance of the Siliguri corridor. Well, the Indian army stepped out and stopped this juggernaut. That came as a bit of a surprise to the Chinese, very upsetting for them. But once again, they've repeated this in Eastern Ladakh, and I think everyone is fully aware what has happened and what is going on there. And I think the Chinese reputation has taken a big beating on these two issues. Then we talk about the Pacific to the east of China. The US Navy dominates the Pacific, and the Indian Navy is there in the Indian Ocean. That's no pushover. Whatever China's aspirations, it is no match militarily to the US, especially its Navy. Another proclivity of China is to create artificial islands by pouring concrete into the oceans and making small airstrips. Well, that's the way a dog marks its territory. You can't base a military strategy on that. And any career group, a career strike group, can put short shift to such artificial bases. You will talk about China's strength as ICBMs, but they are just for show. Any use of ICBMs would lead to its own annihilation. Then you talk of an economy, you talk of the huge amount of US Treasury bonds that China's got. Well, let me put it simply, that's simply an investment. It was not going to redeem those bonds. Its linkages with the Western companies are too beneficial for it to be risked in any way. Its currency is artificially valued, and there's a big opaqueness about its complete economy, which makes it appear much more prosperous than it actually is. And then talking about the People's Liberation Army, the mainstay, the force behind the Communist Party of China. Well, as a military man, I've had a close look at the PLA, and let me tell you, I've come away unimpressed. The human resource is mediocre or less than that. The equipment is adequate but not overwhelming. The armed forces are not battle hardened. The last encounter was in 1979 with Vietnam, where they came away learning a lesson. And I suppose they would be learning the lessons in Eastern Ladakh, like they learned in Doklam. So it is actually much less formidable than its propaganda blitz makes it appear. You may blame me for being very critical on all these aspects of China, but I think there's a definite need to having a real prudent and reality check on different aspects, whether it's the military or the economy or the geopolitics, to get a true feel of the strength that China possesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General Bali. While we are bantering about the BRI, China's dominance, China's problems, as brought out by General Bali, there is also a need to focus on what India needs to project, what India needs to think of in building its own national interests. So I'd like to go to Brigadier Badrinath now to lay out his suggestions for a way ahead for what India needs to do and what strategy should we adopt. Over to you, Brigadier Badrinath.
Thank you once again, sir. In the next few minutes, what I'll try to outline is what we need to do. Now, there are also some questions from some of our observers. Mr. Colonel Brigadier Manrai has asked about India's alternative to the BRI, though I will not give you something which you can call India's response to the BRI, but I will briefly touch upon what I think are the actions that we need to take to counter this whole issue. When we talk of strategy, the first thing that comes to mind is the fabled string of pearls. It's entirely up to us